Welcome back to Nightmare Chronicles, where the dark tales await. If you're ready for another horror-filled adventure, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. Tonight's story will have you questioning what lurks in the dark. The Black Tree of Midnight Grove. Tommy had always been curious about Midnight Grove. The dense forest on the outskirts of town had been the subject of local legend for decades, its name a warning in itself. The trees were ancient, twisted, and so thick that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. The locals claimed the forest was cursed. No one had dared enter after nightfall for generations. Strange things happened there, they said. People went in, but they didn't always come out. Tommy, a skeptic at heart, had always brushed these stories aside. He was used to hearing his friends talk about the haunted woods when they were younger, but they were all too scared to test the tales. Now, at 23, Tommy was no longer afraid of childhood stories. And after hearing yet another tale from his grandmother, he decided it was time to find out what really lay inside Midnight Grove. It was late October when he made up his mind. The full moon hung high in the sky as Tommy entered the edge of the forest. The night was crisp, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. He had heard rumors of an ancient tree, the Black Tree, deep within the woods, a tree that was said to be the source of the strange happenings in the area. According to the stories, the tree was cursed, and anyone who touched it would never leave the forest alive. Tommy didn't believe in curses. He scoffed at the thought as he packed his backpack with a flashlight, a few snacks, and a camera to document his findings. The only thing he was afraid of was not finding anything at all. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees as Tommy walked deeper into the grove. The wind howled through the branches, making the trees groan and creak, but there was something different about tonight. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of small animals, the chirping of insects were strangely absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. As he ventured further into the heart of Midnight Grove, Tommy began to notice the trees growing darker, their bark blackened and twisted as if they had been scorched by fire. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the air cooler. It wasn't long before the faintest trace of an unsettling odor reached his nostrils, rotting wood and something foul like decay. He pushed forward, determined to find the Black Tree and put an end to the myths once and for all. Hours passed, and Tommy's sense of time began to blur. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around him, their shapes almost unnatural. He felt as though he was being watched, though every time he glanced behind him, there was nothing there. The deeper he went, the more the feeling of dread grew. The forest was alive, and it was closing in on him. Finally, he found it. The Black Tree stood in a small clearing, surrounded by a ring of dense, inky fog. Its trunk was enormous, black as coal, and twisted in shapes that seemed almost human. Its branches reached upward, gnarled and skeletal as if grasping at the sky. The air around it felt thick, oppressive, and Tommy could hear a faint whispering in the wind, like distant voices murmuring just beyond his comprehension. Despite his fear, Tommy took a few tentative steps toward the tree. His camera clicked as he snapped a photo of it, but the image on the screen was distorted, like the tree was warping and shifting in the frame. He frowned and tried to take another picture, but the camera wouldn't respond. The lens was fogging up, even though the air felt unnaturally dry. Probably just the cold, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease. Tommy reached out to touch the tree. The moment his hand made contact, the ground beneath him trembled. The whispers around him grew louder, clearer now, as though voices were speaking directly into his mind. He could make out words, but they were not words he could understand. They were foreign, ancient, and filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. He jerked his hand back, but it was too late. The tree began to groan, its branches bending and twisting in unnatural directions, and the fog around it thickened, swirling in tight circles. A low, guttural sound rumbled from deep within the tree, like something old and powerful awakening from a long slumber. Tommy stepped back, his pulse quickening. He felt a cold draft brush past his face, and when he looked up, he saw something that froze him to his core. In the swirling fog, two glowing red eyes were staring back at him. The eyes were enormous, glowing like coals in the darkness, and they moved toward him impossibly fast. The shape that followed them was tall, towering above him, and made entirely of darkness, like the fog itself had taken form. The creature moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, as though it was not entirely part of this world. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. His feet refused to move as he stood frozen, staring at the figure that was now emerging from the fog. It was humanoid in shape, but its limbs were too long, its fingers too thin and elongated like the branches of the black tree itself. The thing's face was nothing but a black void, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. It reached out a skeletal hand toward Tommy, and as it did, the air around him grew unbearably cold. "You should not have touched it," a voice echoed from the depths of the forest, the words reverberating in Tommy's skull. It was the voice of the tree, deep, ancient, and filled with an insatiable hunger. The creature lurched toward him, its fingers stretching out to grab him, but just as its hand brushed against Tommy's shoulder, the ground beneath him gave way. He fell, the world spinning around him as he plummeted into darkness. He felt a cold grip close around his ankle, pulling him deeper into the earth. The whispers became deafening, filling his ears with a maddening chant. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw before everything went black was the glowing red eyes of the creature, staring down at him from the edge of the pit. The next morning, the search party found Tommy's camera lying on the forest floor. Its screen cracked, but the photos on it were nothing like what Tommy had seen. The images were distorted, blurred faces, dark figures lurking in the shadows, and one photo of the black tree with no visible branches, just a hole where the tree's heart should be. But Tommy was gone. No trace of him remained in the forest, except for the faintest trace of glowing red eyes that could still be seen deep within the heart of Midnight Grove, watching anyone who dared to approach. And so the legend of Midnight Grove persisted. People still whispered about the black tree and the creature that guarded it, warning travelers never to touch the tree and never to wander too deep into the forest after dark. For some, the forest was a place of legend. For others, it was a place of darkness and hunger. The Hollow Eyes of Timber Ridge. Ben had always been an adventurous soul. Growing up in a small town surrounded by dense woods, he found solace in the untamed wilderness. The local children would often dare one another to venture deeper into Timber Ridge, a stretch of forest notorious for its eerie atmosphere, but none of them ever ventured too far. The stories were clear. Something was wrong with that place. Whispers of strange sightings, lost hikers, and unexplained disappearances had kept the townsfolk at bay for generations. The woods were not just dark, they were alive. Ben had heard the stories. Everyone in town knew them. The most chilling was about the hollow eyes, black pits where once there were faces which appeared in the trees at dusk. Legend had it that these eyes weren't just mere illusions. They were the watchers of the ridge, creatures that preyed upon the living who ventured too far. But to Ben, they were nothing more than campfire tales to spook the kids. One crisp fall evening, Ben decided to prove to himself and everyone else that the tales were just that, stories. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, a camera, and his usual bravado, he set off toward Timber Ridge at sunset, determined to document the truth. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Ben pushed through the overgrown path that led deeper into the woods. The trees, thick with moss, towered over him, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers trying to claw at the sky. The forest was unusually quiet. No chirping insects, no rustling of small animals. It felt wrong. After an hour of walking, Ben noticed the first signs of what the locals had warned him about. A large oak tree, its bark smooth and unnaturally black, stood in the center of the path. On its trunk were hollow indents, 2 perfect circles, as if eyes had once been carved into it. But the eyes weren't empty. They were filled with a dark, swirling void. Ben leaned in closer, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The air around the tree felt heavy, thick, as if the atmosphere itself had become saturated with something ancient and malevolent. But Ben shook off the creeping unease. "Just a trick of the light," he muttered, snapping a picture of the tree. He felt foolish for even entertaining the thought of something being wrong here. The deeper Ben went, the more the forest seemed to shift. The trees became denser, the canopy thicker, and the path less clear. The moonlight barely broke through the thick layer of fog that now seemed to cling to the ground, swirling around his feet like ghostly fingers. An hour passed, then two. Ben hadn't found anything. No creatures, no hollow-eyed trees, nothing. He was about to turn back when he noticed something odd. The sounds of the forest had stopped entirely. The wind had died. There was no rustling of leaves, no creaking of branches. Just an oppressive silence that made every movement feel amplified, as if the forest was waiting for him to make a mistake. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew through the trees and Ben's flashlight flickered. He cursed under his breath and tapped it, but it refused to come back on. In the dim moonlight, Ben fumbled for his spare batteries in his backpack. When he looked up, his stomach churned. At the far edge of the clearing, a figure stood watching him. Tall, thin, and completely still. It was draped in tattered rags that hung loosely from its body like old decaying skin. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, and its face was obscured by long, dark hair. But what made Ben freeze in his tracks was its eyes, black pits, empty yet somehow full of malevolent intent, like voids that could swallow his very soul. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He opened his mouth to call out, but no sound came. The figure stepped forward, its movement jerky, as though it was not entirely comfortable in its own skin. With each step, the ground beneath its feet seemed to grow colder, darker, and the closer it came, the more the forest seemed to close in around Ben, the trees bending and swaying, their shapes warping in the shadows. Ben took a step back, but his legs were frozen, unwilling to move. He knew he had to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. The figure was now only a few feet away, its face still hidden by the tangled hair, but the black pits of its eyes were locked on him, piercing through the darkness. A voice, cold and distant, whispered from the figure's mouth, "You shouldn't have come." Ben finally broke free of the paralysis. He turned and ran, the sound of his footsteps pounding in his ears, the breath in his lungs sharp and desperate. But the woods seemed to shift with him, twisting in unnatural ways, narrowing the path, making every direction feel like a dead end. The figure was still there, always a step behind him, its hollow eyes burning into the back of his mind. Ben's mind raced as he struggled to find his way out. The trees loomed around him like towering monsters, their branches reaching out to snatch him, to drag him deeper into the woods. He could hear the figure's footsteps now, louder, faster, echoing through the night air. He turned one last corner, hoping for an opening, but what he saw nearly made him stop in his tracks. The path ahead had changed. There, in the center of the clearing, was the same tree with the hollow eyes. It was no longer just a single tree, it had multiplied. The entire grove was filled with them. Hundreds of trees, all with dark, swirling pits where their eyes should be, all staring at him, all watching. Ben screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the trees, and in the distance he heard a low, guttural laugh, inhuman, mocking. The figure was no longer following him. It was standing in the middle of the grove, surrounded by the trees, all of them now alive with the same terrible eyes. The trees began to move, their roots creaking, as if they were awakening from a long slumber. The figure stepped into the center, its face still hidden beneath the mass of hair, but now it raised its arms. The trees trembled, their hollow eyes growing darker. "You will join us now," the voice said again, louder, as though it were coming from everywhere, filling his head, drowning out his thoughts. "We see you. You belong to the ridge." Ben turned and ran, not knowing where he was going, but knowing that if he stopped, it would be the last thing he ever did. His heart raced in his chest as the sounds of the forest twisted around him, the trees closing in from all sides. He stumbled, falling to the ground, but when he looked up, there was no path. There was only the unblinking gaze of the hollow eyes. The last thing Ben saw was the figure stepping forward, its face finally revealed. A face made entirely of hollow pits, no flesh, no eyes, just darkness. Ben was never found. Years later, the town still whispers about Timber Ridge and the Hollow Eyes. The forest has claimed others who dared to enter, their bodies never recovered, their souls lost to the ridge forever. And sometimes, when the wind is right, the locals claim they can hear a faint, distant voice carried on the breeze, someone screaming for help from deep within the forest, forever trapped within the gaze of the hollow eyes. The Lost Ones of Blackthorn Hollow. There was an old tale that haunted the people of Hollow Creek, a small village nestled on the edge of a vast forest. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about Blackthorn Hollow, a part of the forest so remote, so ancient, that even the bravest of souls hesitated to enter. It wasn't the kind of place where anyone went by choice, especially after sunset. The stories spoke of the Lost Ones, shadowy figures said to wander the hollow. These were souls who had once ventured too far into the woods and never returned. Some said they had been claimed by the forest itself, their bodies twisted into something unrecognizable, but their minds still trapped, forever searching for an escape. Others claimed that the Lost Ones weren't dead at all, but had been absorbed into the forest, becoming part of its eternal, dark life. The most chilling part of the tale, though, was the warning. If you ever saw one of the Lost Ones, you should never look into their eyes. If you did, it was said that you would become one of them. None of the villagers had ever dared to go into Blackthorn Hollow, except for one. A young man named Adam, new to the village and skeptical of the old superstitions, decided to test the legend for himself. One autumn evening, Adam made his way toward the hollow. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows across the land. The chill in the air seemed to grow colder the closer he got to the forest's edge, but Adam wasn't afraid. He had read about the hollow, about the trees and the myths, but he thought it was all just stories to scare children. As he stepped into the forest, the air grew heavy with an unnatural stillness. The leaves beneath his feet crunched loudly, too loud, in the silence. The trees here were ancient, their bark gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing upward as if reaching for the sky itself. The deeper Adam went, the darker the forest became. Soon, the fading light of the sun was entirely blocked out by the thick canopy of leaves. He shivered but pressed on, determined to prove that the tales were nothing more than local superstition. As he walked, he noticed something strange. No animals, no birds singing, no rustling in the underbrush. The forest felt empty, as though it were holding its breath, waiting. After an hour of walking, Adam stumbled into a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a large, twisted tree. Its bark was black as coal, and its roots seemed to crawl across the ground like snakes. It was a grotesque sight, an unnatural thing, and Adam's gut twisted with unease. He snapped a picture with his phone, but when he looked at the screen, the image was distorted, as if something was blocking the camera's view. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the clearing, and with it came a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Adam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice came again, closer this time, a faint murmur that seemed to echo from the trees themselves. "Help me." The voice was weak, fragile, and it sent a chill up Adam's spine. He glanced around the clearing, but he could see no one. His breath caught in his throat as the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Please, don't leave me." Adam stepped forward, looking deeper into the forest, his flashlight flickering as he moved. The whisper seemed to come from every direction now, wrapping around him, filling his mind. He could feel the presence of something, someone, watching him, though he saw no one. His pulse quickened. Suddenly, he turned sharply. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam, stood a figure. The figure was tall and gaunt, its form shrouded in a tattered cloak, the hood drawn low. It had no face, just an empty void where its features should have been. The figure stood motionless, and Adam's stomach lurched. He felt a growing sense of terror claw at his chest, but something else tugged at him. A need to understand, to uncover the truth behind the stories. "Who are you?" Adam called out, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound brave. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a single step forward, and then another, moving with slow, deliberate movements, as though the very air around it were thick and heavy. Adam's breath caught in his throat as the figure came closer, the space between them growing shorter, but the figure never made a sound. never made a motion except for its haunting, steady approach. Then, the whisper returned. This time, the voice was coming from within the figure itself, a rasping, desperate whisper that seemed to tear through the stillness like a jagged knife. "Don't look into my eyes." Adam's body froze. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure's hood had fallen back, revealing a face. But there were no eyes, just hollow sockets, black as night, as though the figure had never had eyes at all. The sockets were empty, but the darkness inside them pulled at Adam's very soul, like a vortex pulling him toward the center of its abyss. The voice came again, louder this time, its warning becoming a scream. "Do not look into my eyes. You must not look." But it was too late. Adam's gaze was already locked onto the figure's empty sockets. The moment his eyes met the darkness, a flood of images rushed into his mind. He saw faces, thousands of faces, all twisted in silent screams, their eyes wide and empty. He saw the forest, but it was different, wrong, filled with shadows and things that shouldn't be. And then, there was darkness, an endless, crushing darkness that surrounded him, suffocating him. Adam's mind broke, his consciousness unraveling as the faces of the lost ones filled his vision. He could hear their whispers, their pleas for help, their cries for release. The last thing he felt was the cold hand of the figure reaching out for him, its fingers curling around his wrist with an unnatural strength. And then, everything went black. The next morning, the villagers noticed something strange. Adam's phone was found lying on the edge of Blackthorn Hollow. The screen cracked but still displaying a single image, the face of the figure, its hollow eyes staring back at the camera. No sign of Adam was found, no trace of his body. Days passed, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Adam had gone mad and wandered off into the wilderness. Others whispered that he had become another lost one, claimed by the forest and forever bound to the hollow, his soul trapped in the endless night. Every year the villagers would gather near Blackthorn Hollow to remember Adam, to warn others of the curse that haunted the woods. And every year, there were more whispers, more strange sightings in the forest, as if the lost ones were trying to reach out to find someone else to join them. And sometimes when the wind is right, the villagers say they can hear the whispers again, soft at first, like a faraway voice calling for help. But if you listen too closely, you can hear it more clearly. Don't look into the eyes. The Warden of Hollow Creek. It had always been there. The woods that bordered Hollow Creek, an old, dense forest full of twisted trees and strange tales. People from the village had long been wary of the forest, even in daylight. It wasn't the creatures that scared them. It was the presence of something else, something far older than any man or beast, lurking in the dark corners of the woods. The villagers spoke of the Warden of Hollow Creek, an ancient being who was said to guard the heart of the forest. Legends told that the warden was neither human nor animal, but a creature born of the land itself, a monstrous figure with eyes like burning coals and a voice that could command the earth. The warden had been created long ago to protect something deep in the forest, something so powerful, so dangerous, that no one could ever uncover its secret. The stories were a warning, passed down through generations. Never venture too deep into the woods, and never, under any circumstances, follow the lights at dusk. But like all legends, the warning lost its bite with time. People moved on, and curiosity crept in. That's how it had happened before, how others had vanished into the forest and never returned. Daniel, a young man from Hollow Creek, had heard the stories his whole life, of course. His grandmother had told him stories about the warden, about the strange lights that flickered at the edge of the forest at twilight. He had laughed it off, as anyone would, and had never thought much of it. But curiosity got the better of him. It was on a crisp evening in late autumn when Daniel decided to test the legends for himself. He was no longer a child, no longer afraid of things that went bump in the night. He had grown tired of the village's superstition and was eager to prove it wrong. He grabbed a lantern, packed some provisions, and set off toward the forest as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land. The moment he stepped into the woods, Daniel felt the change. The air was heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and old decay. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted limbs forming a canopy so dense that the dying light of the day barely filtered through. As he walked deeper, the silence was oppressive. There were no sounds, no birds, no rustling of leaves, not even the wind moving through the trees. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of the place, the sensation that he was being watched. Then, as dusk fell, he saw them. At the far end of a narrow clearing, small lights flickered. They were faint at first, like fireflies, but they grew brighter and more distinct, drifting along the edge of the trees, moving in patterns almost as if they were guiding him forward. A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. Never follow the lights. But curiosity pushed him forward, and he took a hesitant step toward them. The lights led him deeper into the woods, moving just beyond his reach, always staying ahead of him. They floated through the trees, darting between the branches, as if teasing him. Daniel felt both entranced and unnerved. The beauty of it all, the way the lights danced and flickered like will-o'-the-wisps, was mesmerizing, but something inside him warned that this was not natural. As he followed the lights, the woods grew darker, the air colder. He heard nothing but the faint whisper of his own breath, the soft crunch of his boots on the undergrowth. The deeper he went, the farther the lights led him, until he realized he had lost all sense of direction. The forest was vast, endless. Suddenly, the lights stopped. Daniel froze in place. In the silence that followed, he could hear something else, a low, rumbling sound like the earth itself was groaning. The ground beneath his feet trembled just slightly, but enough to send a shiver through him. And then, the sound came again, a deep, guttural voice that rumbled through the trees. "Turn back," it said. The voice was ancient, hoarse, like the earth itself had spoken. Daniel's heart raced. He tried to move, but his legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place by the weight of the voice, by the intensity of the presence that surrounded him. He could feel it now, deep in his bones, something enormous, something watching him, moving closer. The ground shook again, this time more violently, and the trees groaned as if bending toward him. Then, the lights appeared again, but this time they were no longer distant. They were right in front of him, swirling around him in a tight circle, as if urging him to move forward. "You were warned," the voice rumbled again. But now, it sounded different, more impatient, more menacing. "Do not test the warden." Daniel stumbled backward, his breath quick and shallow. He turned and ran, the lights chasing him, flickering just behind him like a pack of predators. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the trees closing in, their limbs reaching toward him, as if the forest itself was alive, its roots and branches pulling him back. He ran for what felt like hours, but the lights were always there, always at his heels. He could feel them drawing closer, like hands closing in around him. His panic intensified, his mind racing as he searched for any way to escape. Finally, just as his strength was beginning to give out, he stumbled into a small clearing and the lights vanished. The forest was silent again. Daniel collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. He turned, expecting to see the lights again, or the warden, or whatever had been pursuing him. But there was nothing. The forest had returned to its unnatural stillness. For a moment, Daniel thought he might have imagined the whole thing, until he heard it again. The rumbling, the groan of the earth, and then, a voice, soft and terrifying. "You are the last warning." It wasn't the voice of the forest anymore. It was something older, something more powerful. In a flash, Daniel scrambled to his feet and sprinted back in the direction he had come from. His heart was pounding in his chest and he didn't dare look back. He broke through the edge of the woods just as dawn began to break, his clothes torn, his body bruised, but he was alive. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of the village, his mind reeling, his thoughts a whirlwind. The villagers were waiting for him, their eyes wide with concern. But when they saw his face, pale and terrified, they knew. Daniel never spoke of what happened in the woods, but from that day on, He avoided the forest at all costs, and whenever someone mentioned the lights in the woods or the warden, he would only shake his head and whisper, "It's not a legend." Years later, people still spoke of the strange lights in the woods and the terrifying voice that came from the depths of the forest. The warning still echoed in Hollow Creek: never follow the lights. For those who did, there was only one fate: becoming part of the forest, lost to time and to the warden forever. The 13th tree. There was an ancient grove on the outskirts of the village, a place that no one ventured near, even in daylight. The villagers of North Hollow had learned long ago to avoid it. The trees were twisted, their branches like claws reaching toward the sky, their trunks scarred with deep grooves. They called it the 13th Grove, named after the legend of the 13th tree at its heart. The grove had always been there, even before the village had been founded. Some said the forest was older than time itself, that the trees were the very bones of the earth, twisted by forces beyond understanding. But there was one tree, one ancient oak, that stood apart from the others. Its bark black and cracked, its leaves twisted into unnatural shapes, and its roots sprawling like the fingers of a buried giant. The legend told of the 13th tree, an evil tree that was the source of the grove's darkness. It was said that every 100 years the tree would awaken and claim a soul, drawing someone into the grove to become its guardian. The person chosen would never return, and in their place would grow a new, gnarled branch from the 13th tree's roots, marking the sacrifice. No one knew exactly what happened to those who disappeared into the grove, but the village had its suspicions. The elders spoke in hushed tones about the Watcher, a figure seen only by those who wandered too close to the grove after dark. A figure with hollow, empty eyes, and a face made of bark and wood. One autumn evening, a young man named Jacob, new to North Hollow and unaware of the ancient warnings, heard the story of the 13th tree at the local inn. It was late, and the fire crackled in the hearth as the old man, one of the village's elders, spoke of the legend. The tavern was full, the air thick with ale and smoke, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "They say the 13th tree demands a soul every century," the elder murmured, his voice low and raspy. "It chooses them, and they vanish into the grove, never to return. And when the time comes, there is no escape." Jacob laughed nervously, dismissing the old man's words as nothing more than a drunkard's tale. "It's just a story, right?" he asked, his voice uncertain. The elder's eyes darkened. "Don't go near the grove, lad. You think the woods are just trees and leaves, but they're ancient, old in ways you can't understand. The 13th tree waits, always. It's not a story, it's a warning." But Jacob, full of youthful arrogance, didn't take the warning seriously. That night he found himself lying awake in his small cabin, staring at the ceiling. The thought of the grove nagged at him, growing stronger with every passing moment. He couldn't ignore the curiosity that pulsed within him, an itch he had to scratch. At dawn the next morning, Jacob grabbed his coat and ventured into the woods, the air crisp and biting with the chill of autumn. He didn't know exactly where the grove was, but he had heard whispers from the villagers about it being just beyond the edge of the village, a place untouched by human hands. After a few hours of walking, the trees began to change. The trunks grew darker, twisted into shapes that seemed unnatural. The air thickened with an unsettling stillness, and the sound of birds and animals ceased entirely. The path became harder to follow as roots and undergrowth grew thick beneath his feet, but he pressed on, his desire to uncover the truth stronger than any fear. Finally, he found it, the 13th tree. It was unlike any tree he had ever seen. Its bark was blackened, as though burned by an unholy fire, and its twisted branches hung low, stretching toward the ground like arms reaching for something. The tree stood alone, surrounded by a circle of smaller oaks, all with thick, twisted trunks. The wind seemed to avoid this place, and the air felt suffocating, pressing in on him like a physical weight. Jacob approached the tree cautiously. There was something deeply wrong about it, something ancient and malevolent that sent a ripple of unease through his chest, but he couldn't turn back, not now. He reached out to touch the bark, and as his fingers brushed against it, a cold shock ran through him. He yanked his hand back, but it was too late. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the air around him grew thick, like a dark mist rising from the earth. From the shadows of the trees, something moved. A figure emerged, tall and thin, draped in tattered rags that seemed to be made of bark and leaves. Its face was hollow, a featureless void of wood and darkness with deep cracks running down its length. It was the Watcher, the guardian of the grove. Jacob's heart raced as he stumbled backward, but the Watcher stepped forward, its movement slow but deliberate. With each step it took, the ground seemed to twist beneath it, as though the earth itself was shifting and bending around its presence. "You shouldn't have come," the Watcher whispered, its voice like the creaking of old wood. It spoke in a language Jacob didn't understand, but its meaning was clear. There was no escape now. The Watcher raised a hand, and the air grew colder, the darkness deepening around Jacob. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the 13th tree's roots began to stretch and writhe, as if alive. A single gnarled branch shot out of the tree, reaching for Jacob's chest, and he fell to his knees as an overwhelming force pressed down on him. "You will be the 13th." Jacob tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness that was closing in around him. He looked into the Watcher's eyes, or what should have been eyes, and saw nothing but an abyss, a void that drew him in, pulling at his very soul. His body stiffened, his vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to dissolve into a nightmarish haze. In one final, desperate moment, he reached out, but his hand touched nothing but cold, damp earth. His soul was claimed, and the earth responded with a low, rumbling groan. Days later, the villagers noticed something strange. The ground at the center of the grove had shifted, and a new twisted branch had grown from the 13th tree. It was gnarled, like a hand reaching up from the earth. Its bark cracked and dark as if something had been carved into it, and no one saw Jacob again. The villagers didn't need to speak it aloud, they all knew the truth. The 13th tree had claimed another soul, and as it had for centuries, it would remain hungry, waiting for the next unwitting traveler to wander too close to fall prey to its dark power. From that day on, no one in North Hollow dared speak of the grove or the tree. But sometimes in the dead of night, the wind would carry a whisper through the village, a voice from the deep woods saying only, "You shouldn't have come." The Hollow of Ashes. It was said that the Ashen Woods were cursed, though no one alive knew why. The villagers of Brackenfield had always kept their distance from the woods, and for good reason. The towering trees, their bark covered in patches of gray ash, cast long, unsettling shadows that seemed to shift even when the wind was still. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick with brambles that caught at your clothes like unseen hands. But it wasn't the forest itself that people feared. It was the hollow. The Hollow of Ashes lay at the heart of the forest, a place where no one dared to tread. It was said that long ago, before the village was founded, there had been a great fire, one that consumed the land and left nothing but ash in its wake. The fire had burned for days, leaving behind a blackened, lifeless expanse. But in the center of it all, in the heart of the forest, stood an ancient stone well. According to the old stories, the well had been there before the fire, and when the fire finally died down, the ground around the well was covered in a thick, unnatural fog. People who ventured near the hollow began to disappear. Their bodies were never found, but their voices, the whispers of those who had fallen victim to the hollow, could still be heard in the night. But there were those who, despite the warnings, couldn't resist the pull of the forest's mystery. Adeline had grown up in Brackenfield, hearing the stories of the hollow, the well, and the souls that were said to be trapped there. But she was different from the others. Where the villagers feared, she was curious. And as she grew older, the tales of the hollow began to haunt her dreams, pulling her in like a moth to a flame. She had to see it for herself. She had to know the truth. One cool autumn evening, Adeline set out on her journey. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and a heavy fog clung to the ground, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Her lantern cast a faint glow that barely pierced the thick darkness of the woods. She had heard that the journey to the hollow could take hours, but she was determined to find it. She would not be like the others who simply whispered about it, afraid of what they didn't understand. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the trees grew taller and closer together, their branches intertwining to block out the sky. The light from her lantern flickered and danced with the wind, casting eerie shadows on the twisted trunks. The further she went, the more the forest seemed to close in around her, the air growing heavier with each step. It felt as if the very woods were alive, watching her, waiting for her to cross some unseen line. And then, after what felt like hours, she saw it, a faint flickering light ahead. At first she thought it was another lantern, perhaps another traveler, but as she drew closer, she realized it wasn't a light at all. It was the fog, swirling around something that was rising from the ground. Adeline's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The fog parted, revealing a stone well, ancient and covered in layers of moss and grime. It was massive, almost like a small tower, its stonework cracked and weathered by centuries of neglect. The top of the well was open, and from its depths, a cold wind seemed to rise, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a voice. "Help!" Adeline froze. It wasn't the voice of a living person. It was distorted, like a voice that had been buried deep beneath the earth, twisted by time and despair. Her instincts told her to turn back, but her curiosity kept her rooted to the spot. She stepped closer to the edge of the well, her lantern held high. The voice came again, softer this time. "Help me." It was a plea, a desperate plea for someone to release it from its prison. Without thinking, Adeline reached out toward the well, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, making the lantern flicker violently. The voice, now louder and more desperate, echoed through the woods, filling her mind with a feeling of suffocating dread. "Help me, or you will join me." Adeline stumbled back, her heart racing. The voice had changed, no longer a plea, but a warning. The trees around her began to groan, their limbs creaking and shifting, as if they were alive, stretching toward her. She turned to run, but the fog had thickened, and the path had vanished. It was as if the forest itself was closing in, trapping her within its depths. Panic surged through her as she searched for an escape, but there was no way out. The woods had changed. The trees seemed to move, shifting like living things, their bark peeling away in long strips to reveal something dark and fleshy beneath. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she could hear something heavy moving through the woods, something that was neither human nor animal. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. A figure, towering and skeletal, its form wrapped in tattered rags of decayed flesh. Its eyes were hollow voids, empty and dark, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. It was the Wraith, the guardian of the hollow, and it had been waiting for someone to wander too close. Adeline backed away, her breath shallow and ragged, but the Wraith did not move. It simply stood there, watching her with those empty eyes, its presence filling the air with an unbearable weight. It was as if the very essence of the forest itself had manifested into this creature, a being of darkness and despair. A deep, guttural voice echoed from within the Wraith's hollow chest. "You have come to the hollow. Now you must stay." Adeline's mind screamed for escape, but her legs would not move. The forest was alive with a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. She could feel it in the ground beneath her feet, the air around her, the very trees that seemed to breathe with a mind of their own. The Wraith took a step forward, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open, revealing an endless black abyss that seemed to go on forever. "Join me. Join us," the Wraith whispered, its voice growing louder, as if the forest itself was speaking through it. Suddenly, Adeline felt the weight of 1,000 hands on her shoulders, pulling her toward the abyss. The trees moaned, the fog thickened, and the voice of the Wraith grew louder, more insistent. The darkness called to her, pulling her closer, suffocating her with its presence. With a final desperate cry, Adeline tore herself free from the Wraith's grasp, running blindly through the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. But the trees closed in around her and the fog grew thicker, blurring her vision until she couldn't see her own hands in front of her. The wraith's voice echoed in her ears, a haunting whisper that would never leave her. There is no escape. Adeline ran, and she ran, but she never found the way out. Days later, the villagers found her lantern at the edge of the hollow, but there was no sign of Adeline. Some say they can still hear her voice in the wind, her whispers carried by the fog that rolls through the ashen woods at night. They say she is still there, trapped in the hollow, her soul claimed by the wraith and the forest it guards. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the soft whispers of the hollow, calling to those who dare to venture too far. Help me. Another dark tale comes to an end, but don't worry, there's plenty more where that came from. Hit the subscribe button, like, and comment to let me know which part gave you the creeps. Stay tuned, and remember, you never know what's lurking just around the corner.